the latest policy we've got, it's called Drain the BILLABONG, which is of course a play on the idea of draining the swamp. We've seen that bureaucracy becomes so overbearing. If it's never reformed or if it's never held to account, it's never made accountable, less bureaucracy would mean more freedom. And so what we're doing with Drain the BILLABONG is trying to hold the bureaucrats to account. Again, like I said before, this is an argument basically to save the economy, because the economy actually becomes the culture. And I've never seen so many buildings and shop fronts for lease, particularly in what they, once used to call marvellous Melbourne. It's just a shadow of its former self. And so if the bureaucrats aren't held to account, I end up with people like I talked to this woman the other day, and she's telling me about her husband's construction business. He's got a small construction company. He's been operating for many, many, many years, and he didn't want to get his workers mandated, but eventually got to a point where he couldn't hold out any longer. They got mandated, and one of his apprentice electricians got COVID, and he alleged that he got COVID on the work site. Now, the proprietor of the business was a bit concerned about that. How do you know it was actually on the work site? You're here for 8 hours, but you've got another 16 hours of your day. But work cover found in the employee's favour that he had actually acquired COVID at the work site, and the guy hasn't been back to work now for 6 months, and the proprietor of the business has met with some expense as a result of that. But it would have been worse if he hadn't have mandated people having the jab. So you can see how the bureaucrats have caught us in a bind. They pretend it's not mandated. We're not being coerced, but we are being coerced, because if he hadn't have had that worker vaccinated, then he would have been up for the whole cost of his compensation. And what does that turn into? Who knows what it turns into ultimately. Hasn't been to work for 6 months. The guy hasn't been able to replace him. And his wife is so worried that she just wants him to stop operating the business, because she doesn't trust the business environment in Victoria as it exists at the moment. She doesn't trust the science around the mandates, and she doesn't trust what will happen to her husband. And she's seen the deleterious effects that mentally this toll is already taking on her husband. And whenever I talk to people, there's just swathes of this happening throughout the entire community. People are being divided. And I'm talking families, I'm talking husband and wives that are splitting up, children that aren't talking to parents anymore, or the other way around, parents that aren't talking to children anymore, all over something that didn't even exist 2 years ago, your status, your medical status. And it's against every anti-discrimination law that the governments continually pass, keep, pumping their chests up. They're so proud of these new anti-discrimination laws, yet suddenly you're allowed to discriminate whenever you want. It's wrong. It's wrong, and that's why, really, ultimately, the bureaucrats have to be held to account. And the only way ultimately to hold them to account is to index their wages to the wages of people in the private sector, in the market economy. So if wages are going down for us, as they certainly did throughout the pandemic, why was there, in Victoria in particular, there was 2 indexed wage increases for the bureaucracy throughout that time? That's an absolute insult, because where's that money coming from? The culture. But aren't we all in this together? Well, if we were truly all in it together, then it's a simple proposition to index the wages that the bureaucrats earn to those earned in the private sector. So whatever the average wage is, then the average wage will be that for the bureaucrat as well. There may be some exceptions with some bureaucrats that are higher up in the bureaucracy, but ultimately that's the fundamental principle. So if the wages go up in the private sector, the wages go up in the public sector. If the wages go down in the private sector, accordingly, the wages come down. And then we will truly all be in it together, because it's the same pool of money that's being drawn from. And there was such insult to people. I had a woman who ran a health food business, and it didn't fall under any mandate. She continued to do it from home, make her health food bars, etc. But the shops she sold them to, the health food shops, they weren't allowed to open. They were not essential services. So they qualified for JobKeeper, but she didn't qualify for JobKeeper. Yet she couldn't sell her product to anyone. What? The absurdity. Yet you could go to McDonald's or KFC or Burger King. That was fine. But wasn't it a health crisis? So why were those foods still available to us, but not health foods? It's insanity, it's madness, and it can only be changed if the bureaucrats are placed under some scrutiny. They need to be scrutinised, and that's why we come back to this policy, which is drain the billabong and basically drain the propaganda machine that's enforcing it And so much of our money goes into the public broadcaster, obviously, the Australian Broadcasting Corporation, and they did not at any point speak on behalf of Australians that were against the COVID narrative. So why is that not being reported? Why is there 500,000 plus Victorians 4 weekends in a row gathering on the steps of Parliament to silence, but worse than that, to absolute ridicule from the mainstream media narrative? And why isn't there one Victorian out of 227 federal parliamentarians? There is not one parliamentarian from Victoria standing against the narrative. There is 7 parliamentarians all up in the federal parliament that are actually somewhat openly questioning where we're at as a culture. Why is there no Victorian there? Why? It's important that we do get a Victorian there to institute policies like this, which is to push back against the bureaucracy, because if government's left unaccountable, just grows and grows and grows and grows, we'll all suffer as a result and live under a tyranny, an unaccountable tyranny. Spoken by D. Richardson, authorised by D. Richardson, Melbourne.